Hi, this is the video explanation for Assessment Task 1, Exploring, Interpreting, and Interpreting Curriculum. Now this assignment is worth 40%, and really the point and the purpose of this particular assessment task is to begin scaffolding and help guiding you through the lesson planning process. Now I know that some of you will have already created some lesson plans for other units. So the point of this is really just to again kind of further your understanding of lesson planning. So if you've had some experience, then you can obviously contribute to it, but please do not use lessons that you've already used. You might use the same topic, but give this an opportunity for you to do another original lesson. And that's partly because you need to, throughout your time here at universities, collect as much evidence that you can plan for lessons and so on. So as many as you can is really great, but if you have 4 lesson plans and they're all on the same topic, then you can only use one. So do try to use this as an opportunity to build your portfolio for teaching. So this assessment task, as I mentioned, is a lesson plan, and it is due on Sunday, as we usually have it due on Sunday, the 2nd of September. 5 minutes to midnight. So these are kind of the main aspects of the assessment task. The first is that you are going to design a lesson plan, but we've given you a lesson template. Now it's really important to understand that you need to complete the lesson template, and there is a reflection as part of that, but for this assignment, you need to use that particular lesson template. Don't use another lesson template, use that particular lesson template. We provided specific aspects that we want you to complete and guiding questions, so please use that template.
And that template will be, once you filled it in, will be what you upload to Moodle.
Yes, and it is available on Moodle in the assessment section. Now this lesson plan is a single 50-minute lesson, so assuming that you have the students for 50 minutes. And you are going to link your lesson to the Victorian curriculum. So this means that we are looking at foundation or prep to year 10. Now some of you might say, oh, I'd really like to make an early, create an early years lesson plan, or I want to do VCE. For this particular assignment, you need to use the Victorian curriculum. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that when we mark these assignments, we're being consistent. So it makes it a lot easier if we're all using the same framework, which is the Victorian curriculum. So if you are an early years prime student, please maybe consider doing prep 1 or 2. And if you are more interested in VCE, maybe just consider doing something that is in year 10 that was maybe kind of preparing students for VCE. So you'll link, and I'm going to explain in just a minute how you link your lesson back to the Victorian curriculum for those who have not had much experience with the Victorian curriculum. You will also need to suggest appropriate formative and/or summative assessment tasks to support and measure learning. Now we're going to cover this in week 6, which I know is the final week before it's due, but we will kind of prompt some of these things in class before then, so don't stress too much, and it is a very small section of the lesson plan. The final part is the reflection, and that's a reflection on your lesson planning experience. So you need to think about what were the theories that supported your design. So for example, did you use group work, and why did you decide to use group work? Maybe you decided to break up the lesson into smaller sections. Well, why did you do that? So maybe trying to connect then to articles or readings that support those theories. We've, in 1303, covered quite a few theories in regards to, collaborative work. So, Vygotsky, we talked about this idea that interaction, we use interaction to build understanding and meeting. So you can pull from your 1303 textbooks if you have one. If you don't, you can find one in the library to pull on some of those theories. But these theories then help support, well, why did you choose those particular activities and so on. So and if you have a specific area of science or HPE, for example, you can look at maybe some articles that look at some evidence-based practices that have worked, and then maybe incorporate that within your lesson plan. The other thing that you'll reflect on is contingency plans, and contingency plans is basically thinking about what could go wrong. So for example, if you're doing something with iPads, and then you realize that the iPad chargers didn't charge overnight, and so you have no iPads. Well, what are you going to do? So think about what could go wrong. Let's say you have pair work, and then you realize that you have an odd number. So think about what could happen and what are some alternatives if that happens.
And you don't have to think about sort of every perceived problem that might go wrong, but I suppose sort of some key contingencies that you can put in place for some of those major issues that might appear.
Yes. And then the final thing is thinking about how might you, so when you link to the Victorian curriculum, you're actually looking at one level. So level 3 or level 7, you're choosing one level and in one content area. So that might be English, maths, arts, whatever it is, but one particular area. But as you probably already know, as teachers, we don't necessarily just use these isolated lessons. We actually do connect it to other disciplines. So this is your opportunity to then talk about how you might actually connect it to other disciplines. So, how you might connect it to sustainability or looking at capabilities like creativity. So, and there's some examples in the lesson template to help you think through that. So this is just kind of an overview of this assignment. We hope that this assignment will not only kind of help you get some feedback on some of those decision making that you're doing in creating this lesson plan, but that you might be able to kind of really get the practical side of things in creating this lesson plan. This is just an overview of the curriculum. Now, just a few things. If you see this little pointer here, this is the Foundation to 10 Victorian curriculum, and you can click, this is in the curriculum area, but if you want to go to the curriculum, you need to click on this. There's an introduction that gives a whole bunch of information about it, but you want the curriculum. And you have the different levels. And of course, we often associate these with a year level, but technically it's supposed to be a continuum. So for example, you could be teaching a year 7 class, but you could have students working at a level 6 or a level 9, okay? But the main thing with this assignment is you need to be looking at the content descriptions and the achievement standards. So for example, if we're looking at level 2, there's the level 2 description, which tells you about level 2. You don't really need to know that information. What you need to know is the content descriptors, and they will have different things. So you might think of one thing. So this one's understanding that different types of text have, I don't know what it is, because it's obviously cut off, my bad. But maybe use that as a content descriptor. So that's what you want to look at as the text structure and organization. Then there's going to be achievement standards. Now the achievement standards are kind of more in paragraph form, but they basically summarize some of the main content descriptors. You need to, in your lesson plan, link back to both the content descriptors and the achievement standards, because there's a different, content descriptors are really about what you are going to teach, and achievement standards are how you decide if students were actually, learned what you were trying to teach. Just to give you a little idea of this first part, they're linking back, so the learning outcomes. What do you want the students to learn in the lesson? This is where you link back to the content descriptors in one learning area or content area, that's English, maths, science, arts, so on, in one year level. So you need to have that. Do not choose more than 2. 1 or 2 content descriptors is fine. Then you need to find the core, the one that matches the achievement standard, usually one achievement standard that matches or somewhat sums up these content descriptors. So 1 or 2, but do not go more than 2, because then you're doing too much. Ideally, if you just choose 1, make it really nice and simple, that's the best. So this is where you link to the Victorian curriculum. So again, the learning outcomes is what do you want the students to learn in this lesson? And then the achievement standards, how well do the students learn the content? So you're linking back to the curriculum here. The students' prior learning, what has already been taught or learned about the content. So this is where you're talking about what have you already been working on to get to this point. What activities have you done? Is this a completely new topic, or have you done some, if you're doing fractions, what have you done before fractions to kind of help them to kind of take this on? So obviously, because this is a single lesson, you would have been doing other things before it. So think about what has been taught or learned about this content or skill, to give an idea of where this sits within the teaching and learning cycle. And
just on that, you can also have a look at the Victorian curriculum at the prior level. So if you're looking at sort of year 8, you might look at the content descriptions and the achievement standards for year 7 in and around the topic you're choosing in the subject area, and that might sort of give you a sort of a bit of an insight into what some of the prior learning you might be able to put in there.
Absolutely. And then the teaching and learning preparation. So what resources will you need to prepare? So this is things, are you going to be using iPads? Are you going to be using any activities, or what do you need pens and paper, what do you need for this particular sort of thing. So that's just an idea of the resources that you might need.
So then we have the outline of what the actual lesson will comprise of. And this lesson plan template is adapted from one that the placement experience or the professional placement consultants, the PPCs, provide to students through the professional experience units. So we've sort of adapted a little bit, but some of it's similar. So hopefully when you do get out to teaching, especially in sort of second year and beyond, you'll see a version of this lesson plan as well that you'll be able to, so at least you've had an introduction to it. So again, so this is split up into an introduction and sort of main activities and then a conclusion to sort of structure your lesson. So and you can see on the left hand side here we've got some guiding questions about to help you think about, you know, sort of how you'll structure and what you'll incorporate in this actual introduction. I suppose overall, part of that, you know, the initial part of the lesson plan template was looking at your content descriptions. And so what are you going to focus on? What do you want students to focus on and learn through the course of your lesson? So it's really important to have those in mind as you're creating your activities. So and remembering that whatever the activities are that you go through, that they actually, at the end of the lesson, lead to and relate to the learning intentions or the content description that you're focusing on in this lesson. There's no good doing a lesson that where a bunch of activities don't actually address the actual learning outcome or content description that you've come up with. So making sure that there's synergy between the two. So you can see there we start off with an introduction, so thinking about how you'll sort of explain and introduce the lesson, how you explain what you expect students to learn, thinking about how to sort of motivate them, so it might be some sort of icebreaker or anything like that. What sort of questions you might ask, you might be thinking about what prior learning or review you want students to be reminded of at the start of this lesson. And again, that's might link back to the prior learning. So give students a chance to review that. And as it says there, linking to prior learning experiences. So questioning students and what sort of questions you might pose to them to have them thinking about and sort of setting in context what you're going to cover in the rest of the lesson as part of your introduction. Then of course we get into the actual sort of, I suppose, the bulk of the lesson and looking at sort of teaching strategies or learning activities. So as the guiding questions show, what strategies will the students be engaged in, again, to achieve the learning outcomes, and thinking about differentiation, so how you're going to cater for students of different needs, and students with special needs, students who might need more support, students who might need extension work, how you sort of cater for that in these learning activities. So there is some diversification there in the learning activities, and not just sort of all pitched at one level. Thinking about, you might have a series of smaller activities depending on the year level. So thinking about the transition between different phases. Sometimes in the early years we have, or earlier years, younger primary years, we'll have sort of workstations where students might be doing different activities, and then during the course of the lesson they might revolve around sort of one or two or three of those different workstations. So thinking about how you're going to manage those transitions, and including that detail here in this lesson plan. And again, thinking about the questions you're going to pose to students, either in small groups or one-on-one, or to the whole class during those activities. What sort of questions might you ask? And they might differ depending on whether you're asking them of a small group or whether you're asking specific students one-on-one. Then we have the conclusion. And I suppose a 50-minute lesson, you might be looking at sort of, say, a 5 to 10 minute introduction, then you're probably looking at a 30 or 40 minute sort of that teaching strategies, learning activities, and then say a 5 or 10 minute conclusion is probably nice way to sort of think about in terms of the timing. So thinking about your conclusion, so how you have students sort of share and articulate you know, the main ideas of the lesson, and again, what sort of questions will you pose to them, what sort of feedback will you get from them, and be able to sort of ascertain what they've understood from the lesson, and again, sort of linking this back to thinking about your the learning outcomes and the content descriptions that you came up with at the start of the template, how you're going to sort of include those in this sort of conclusion and capture that main focus from your lesson with your students. So thinking about how you'll discuss that with students and how you'll sort of conclude the lesson. Then we have the assessment stage. So we might have, we're thinking about what sort of formative or summative assessment strategies might be used in this lesson. And it can be assessment during the lesson, it might be after or at the start of the lesson. And you can think of formal and informal assessment strategies. Then again, linking back to the achievement standards, how will you know that the students have achieved these stated achievement standards, or that they're on a continuum towards achieving them? So thinking about how you capture that information, how will you find that out? Will you collect work samples? Will it be through questioning? Will you use some ad hoc notes on specific students? And again, how will you record how students, what their learning outcomes from this lesson are?
And just to add to that one, I think that a lot of it will be informal in a 50-minute lesson. I mean, you're obviously not going to have a 20-minute quiz or something during it, but, you know, teachers use questioning and to often find out what students know already. So at the beginning, finding out what students know and where to kind of take the lesson. And they use, you know, just, you know, collect, if they're working in groups, just finding out what they're listening to and monitoring some of that. That's informal assessment. So you might just kind of talk about this. Now, this is not a different part of the lesson. This is just talking through how you might assess this. And it could be after the lesson, you might have a more formal assessment after that might incorporate other aspects. But you might be doing some very informal kind of noticing of what students are doing and how well they have they've achieved or are progressing towards the achievement standard in that particular lesson. Okay, now the reflection is kind of the part, I mean, this would probably be about 400 or 500 words. Now, the equivalent of this assessment, the word count for this assessment task is equivalent to 1,600 words, I believe. 1,600
Yep.
words, yes. And when it says equivalent, it means that we're not looking specifically at 1,600 words. That's just a guide. But because we don't really know, it really depends on your lesson. But for the reflection, I would be thinking about 500 words would be kind of a general guide to that. But this is where you're not going to be referencing throughout your lesson plan, but here you will do some referencing. And a guide would be about 3 references. And I'll kind of walk you through that. So the first part is what theories support or guide your design or teaching decision making. And as I mentioned earlier, that might be about you know, why you chose activities you did, why you did group work, why you had students, particular students together, so on. And that's where you can, I would be thinking 1 or 2, probably 2 articles or readings that you are kind of linking to say, this is why I chose to do this activity because so-and-so says that this type of activity encourages learning, so on. You know, what aspects of the lessons might not go as planned. So this is the contingency plans that we talked about. And then the interdisciplinary. So in the interdisciplinary, that's where you might actually be referring back to the Victorian curriculum. So you might be referring back to science or to something else. So that's your 3 references. So maybe 2 at least for your theories and supporting your design and teaching decision making, and then linking back to other parts of the curriculum would be in that number 3. But this is really to kind of get you to think about, I mean, part of lesson planning is making you explicitly think about those decisions you make in regards to lesson planning. Everyone has this comment about, well, nobody really writes lesson plans once they're teaching, but they still go through those processes, those thinking processes. So this is getting you to explicitly think about, you know, why you made those those decisions in regards to your teaching. We're not going to go through the rubric because this is obviously getting really long. Sorry to keep you for this long at the moment, but the first criteria is a clear understanding of the lesson planning is evident, articulating clear learning intentions and providing links. So that's that first part of the lesson plan. That's what we're kind of looking at. Have you been able to really identify learning outcomes and achievement standards and explain that? Is it evident that you understand the Victorian curriculum? And then a lesson plan which demonstrates planning, provides a clear sequence, and is supported by appropriate strategies and resources. So that's really also looking at that plan of the introduction, the strategies, and the conclusion. So that's obviously 30%, that's the biggest part. Then this aspect of assessment, informative and or summative. So have you been able to discuss that? That's 10%. And then the reflection is 20%. And of course we have the literacy, the academic literacy and language aspects. So make sure you do proofread. We will again scaffold these in the tutorials, but
especially in weeks 4 and 5.
But we hope this was helpful. Great week.
Thank you.
Bye.